Hi, I'm Femi OK. You're watching The Stream. In today's episode, we are going to be joined by Clint Smith. He is a writer, a poet, and the author of this new book, How the Word is Passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America. Clint, it is so good to see you. Welcome to The Stream. Whew. It was a journey through Black history. I wanted to go visit every single chapter in real life. When you sat down to write this book, what was your mission?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. The origin of the book originated in my hometown in New Orleans. And I was watching several Confederate statues and monuments come down. And PGT Beauregard, the Confederate general, Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, Robert E. Lee, Confederate general, and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what does that mean? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. To get to that, my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That the street my parents live on is named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? Because we know that symbols and iconography and names are not just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And the stories people tell shape the narratives communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which isn't to say that taking down a statue of an enslaver is going to erase the racial wealth gap in the contemporary United States. But it is to say that all these things are part of the same ecosystem of stories that help us make sense of what has happened to communities and thus what must be done for communities in order to move forward. And so I was thinking about that in my hometown in New Orleans, and I wanted to sort of broaden it out and explore how different places across the country and even across the ocean reckon with or fail to reckon with their own relationship to the history of slavery.
You tell stories, I don't want to call it Black history, I'm going to call it American history. You tell American history with such ease and comfort and the ability to draw people in, whether they're white or they're not white. You help share those stories. That is all history is, sharing stories. So why in the United States is it so difficult to share the stories of everybody, not just the stories of the ancestors of white Europeans?
I think because it calls into question so much of the narrative that has shaped contemporary America. I mean, America is predicated on the myth of meritocracy. It is predicated on the idea that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is because of people in those communities and what they have or haven't done, and not because of what has been done to certain communities generation after generation after generation. And so if we take an honest account of what has happened to people and different groups of people over the course of American history, and we account for the harm that has been done and how recent that harm is, right? Like part of what I write about in this book is not only our physical proximity to this period of time, but our temporal proximity to it. I think all the time about how slavery existed for 250 years in this country and has only not existed for 150. So you have this institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't. You have the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is the big Smithsonian museum documenting African American life that opened here in the United States in 2016. The woman who opened that museum alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter. She was the daughter in 2016 of someone born into intergenerational chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So I think about my 4-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap, and I imagine him sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't that long ago at all. And when you realize our proximity to this period of history, then it makes clear that our contemporary social, economic, and political infrastructure is fundamentally tied to that, and thus calls into question so many of the ideas that people have around why certain communities do or don't have certain things.
So Clint, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to ask our YouTube audience who are watching right now, if you have a question or a comment about American history that you want to ask Clint about, and he comes through the lens of remembering that so many of Black Americans have a history of chattel slavery, then you can be in our YouTube comment section right away, and I'll try and bring those conversations, those comments into our show. Clint, I have a question. This is a question from Hope. She's on video. Have a listen and then respond to her.
I wanted to ask Mr. Smith, what did you find most difficult in the writing and researching of this book? What did you find the most rewarding and inspiring in the writing and researching of this book?
Thank you so much for the question, Hope. The most difficult thing was my trip to Angola. I've worked in prisons and taught in prisons and jails for the past 7 years as a teacher. And I thought I was familiar with the landscape of incarceration in this country until I went to Angola. And for context, Angola prison is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It's 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan in New York. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former slave plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist in that sort of context. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences who work in fields of what was once a plantation while someone watches them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder, where they work for virtually no pay. And so what does it mean that that place exists in that context, in that moment? What does it mean? How does white supremacy not only enact physical violence against people's bodies, but also numb us collectively to certain types of violences? And what does it mean that that place has a gift shop? Right? There's a gift shop at the largest maximum security prison in the country where they sell shot glasses and coffee mugs and stuffed animals and sweatshirts and baseball caps. There was a prison mug, or there was a coffee mug that had a silhouette of a watchtower on it, and it said Angola.
A gated community. I'm looking at your Twitter feed right now. When you look at this, you're like, what the what? Right?
It's not only that this place is not interested in any sort of interrogation of its relationship to this history, which is bad enough, but that it is making a mockery of and seemingly belittling the reality of the conditions that thousands of people in that prison continue to live in. There's a long way of saying that that was the most unsettling and haunting piece of what I experienced.
I want to talk about Monticello, which is the first chapter of your book. Monticello was the home of Thomas Jefferson. He was responsible for the Declaration of Independence. He's a really well-known historical figure, even for Americans who may not know their history in too much detail. Let me just play you a little clip from the website, because this is often how Thomas Jefferson is remembered. Have a listen, have a look.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So, Clint, this is historic, it is epic, missing out big details from what a lot of Americans learn about their own history. So you went to Monticello, and what did you find out?
Monticello was the top of my list of places that I wanted to go because I think that Jefferson embodies so many of the contradictions and the hypocrisy and the complexity of the American project, in the sense that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for upward mobility and wealth accumulation for millions and millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed to create that upward mobility for others. And Jefferson is someone who within himself wrote in one book, in one document, that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. He wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman on his plantation, Sally Hemings. And so I wanted to go to Monticello to see, how does an institution that is responsible for capturing and conveying the legacy of this person tell an honest, holistic, full story of who this person was and what he represented and the contradictions embodied within his life. And not only that, but how does it tell the story of the enslaved people who lived at Monticello, the hundreds of enslaved people across generations who lived and made homes and built community and fell in love and got married and had built lives at this place that in many ways belonged to them more than it belonged to Jefferson. Jefferson was away in Paris and Philadelphia and New York and Washington, D.C. for extended periods of time. And it was these enslaved people, the Hemingses, the Fawcett's, the Grangers, who made a life and who cultivated and made that land possible, and who also made everything Jefferson did in his life possible. We cannot understand Thomas Jefferson, one of the most important founding fathers of our country, and all that he contributed to the American experiment, without understanding that all of the time that he had, all of the ideas he was able to sit with and wrestle with and write about were possible because of the enslaved labor that he had working for him on his plantation.
So, it's hard to believe that in 2021 there are people who do not know that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. As a former teacher, what do you think about that, or enslaved people?
I mean, I encountered some of those folks when I was at Monticello, ironically enough. You know, I two women, Donna and Grace, who I met when I went to Monticello, and I went up to them after I went on the Slavery at Monticello tour, which is a tour at Monticello that focuses specifically on the legacy of slavery and its relationship to Jefferson. And I went up to them after, and they said, it really took the shine off the guy. Like, I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea that Monticello was a plantation.
What did your face do, Clint, when they said that? Or how do you handle that?
I think you try to extend whatever grace and generosity you can to people, especially in this context, because you are asking strangers questions that are in many ways deeply personal and reveal themselves to be deeply shameful. And so I'm not attempting to, in this book, present myself in any way that is sort of antagonistic. I'm not attempting to do a sort of gotcha or like, I can't believe you don't know this. What it reflects to me is a profound failure of our public consciousness, a profound failure in the way that we teach the history of American slavery.
Huge failure, huge. It's not shocking because we know that the education system in America could be better, but this is like America 101.
And the reality is that for so many people, they have no idea. They have no idea, and it is a reminder. I think for so many of us, it can be easy to forget that there are many people who aren't thinking about or engaging with or are ever presented with this history. And so when I was speaking to Donna and Grace, it was clear that their foundation was being shaken. Like the idea that this founding father, this person whose home they had come to as sort of a pilgrimage, almost. They got on planes, they rented cars, they got hotel rooms to come to the home of Thomas Jefferson, and had no idea that he owned human beings. And again, what does that reflect? For me, it was an important reminder of the way how so many millions of people in America in no way understand slavery in any way that is commensurate with the actual impact that it had on this country. And how much different would our understanding of what America looks like today be if we had a collective understanding of what has happened here, if we had a collective understanding of who our founding fathers actually were, if we had a collective understanding of all that has been done in this country's name and who it has been done at the expense of.
One of my favorite places that you visited that made me want to go there, because you tell your story as a novel. It's history, it's fact, you really met these people, but you write it as if we're going on a journey with you, the narrator, and it's like a story. Have a look here. This is a thread that I really like. One, because the selfies are fun, but two, because the storytelling that you weave into the thread is really important. I traveled to Whitney Plantation, the only plantation in Louisiana, and the one and only in the country that is dedicated to telling the story of slavery from the perspective of the enslaved. And I love this place just from the book, from the pages, because it felt like I was there. And one of the guides explained it almost like it was like a history book, but if you could be in the book. What was different about this plantation?
Yeah, the Whitney Plantation is a remarkable place. It is, as I say, one of the only plantations in the country that tells the story of slavery through the perspective of enslaved people. And the thing is that shouldn't be remarkable. But it is. It is a place that is surrounded by a constellation of plantations where people continue to hold weddings, where people, I talked to wedding planners who talked about how sometimes people use the former slave cabins at these other plantations as bridal suites. So what does it mean that someone would want to celebrate the most joyous day of their life, arguably, on the site of intergenerational torture? And so the Whitney Plantation is sort of situated in the midst of that ahistoricism. And it fundamentally rejects the idea that we can understand slavery or understand a plantation as anything other than an intergenerational site of torture. And also that at the same time, while we're understanding the system as one of torture, we are also understanding the people as fully human, as fully embodied persons. And part of what they do is make sure that you are confronting the names and the words, and to whatever extent possible, the faces of people who had been enslaved, and often doing it through the perspective of women and children who, in our public consciousness, to the extent there is one about slavery, is often a very gendered one that renders slavery as a very masculine product or phenomenon, when it is actually something that impacted women and children in really specific and insidious ways that the Whitney has made an effort to uplift.
It's interesting that Sherry has a question for you, and I'm going to bring that question in a moment, but the parts of the book where I really felt you as a man, as a person, was when you were talking about children, when they were in these awful situations as enslaved people, and the children, most children didn't make it past the age of 5 years old. Mothers sometimes would kill their kids because they didn't want them to end up as enslaved. Young girls, young women were assaulted, raped year after year after year after year. Their families were separated. It goes on and on and on and on. Sherry has this question for you about, here's the question.
Dr. Smith, thank you so much for how the word is passed. We cannot read this book and remain detached. We go through it thinking about how we are connected to these events and also how our families are connected to these legacies. And so my question for you is, how has this project changed you or your outlook as an educator and as a parent?
Thank you so much for that question, Sherry. One thing that it has done, I think for whatever reason, so much of my understanding of slavery, which I think is reflective of how so many people understand the institution, was centered on the spectacle of cruelty, which is to say the whippings and the beatings and the brutality and the torture, right? The torture that one experienced while working in the fields or being subject to the sort of omnipresent dominion of the whip and the lash. I think what working on this book did was give me a more acute understanding, to the extent that I can have one, of the role that family separation played in sort of psychological and emotional terror that is embodied within that. And I think part of that is because as I was writing it, my wife and I had 2 children of our own. So now I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And when you just take a moment to sort of think about, like, if I am to think about if I were asleep at night and then I woke up and my children were gone, just disappeared in the middle of the night, I cannot even bring myself to imagine how, even saying it, I'm like becoming full, how profoundly horrific that would be. Right? The idea that at any moment I could be separated from my children and would never see them again. And this is something that millions of enslaved people lived through across generations, that at any moment you could be separated from your loved ones, your children, your husband, your wife, your parents, your community, and you might never see them again. And for some reason, I knew family separation was a part of it, clearly, but I never really sat down to reflect on the sort of emotional and psychological implications of that. And I think going to a place like the Whitney that focuses so much on the lives of children really made it a much more intimate and sort of visceral sort of exercise to imagine what that must have been like for people to know that could happen at any moment.
When you talk about African Americans and history, it always feels relevant. There's no time where it doesn't feel relevant. So your book is very timely, but it's always going to be timely because African Americans are so woven into the history of America. Juneteenth is one example of that. I always was amazed by the story of Juneteenth, which was that it took a while for all Americans and all African Americans to realize that slavery has actually ended. And when that word came to Galveston in Texas, that day was known as Juneteenth. This is a very brief history. I know Clint can do it better, but the reason I want to explain that is because we have a commenter who wanted to ask you about Juneteenth and the whole idea of what Juneteenth means. So this is Rashawn. Yeah, this is Rashawn, excuse me, you could hear my brain cells thinking there. Rashawn, who's saying Juneteenth is a very special holiday. It is now an official federal holiday in the United States. This is what he has to say about Juneteenth. Clint, have a listen.
Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday is a big deal, and all Americans should embrace it and celebrate it as Juneteenth becomes our 11th federal holiday. But make no mistake, Juneteenth becoming a holiday is simply symbolic in nature. It does nothing to address the bodily, economic, and emotional wounds that slavery put onto Black Americans. Only reparations can help to deal with that. Imagine if 156 years after the Holocaust, the only thing that Germany did was create a federal holiday. That is the current status of what is happening to Black Americans in the United States. Juneteenth can help to continue to educate us to change some of these outcomes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Rashawn, who that we should not mistake the holiday of Juneteenth for material resources that deserve to be deserve to be given to in order to repair the harm that has been done to certain communities. What I'll say about it is, I think of it as a sort of both and. There's a both and in this too, right? It is absolutely true that Juneteenth in and of itself is not enough. But I would not go as far to say, and I don't think Rashawn is saying this, that it doesn't matter. Because it does matter. It does matter that there is now a holiday that in its own way celebrates the end of one of the worst things that this country has ever done. And it matters because Black activists, and specifically Black activists in Texas, have been fighting for recognition of Juneteenth and have been fighting for Juneteenth to become a federal holiday for decades and decades and decades. And so if I were to sit here and say it doesn't matter, then I think I would be doing a disservice to the work that so many Black activists have been doing of decades. But with that said, to Rashawn's point, it in and of itself is not enough. And I think what we're experiencing now is this sort of marathon of cognitive dissonance that is reflective of the way that Black Americans have experienced this country since we were brought here, which is to say that you have Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday at the same time that there is a state-sanctioned effort across state legislatures throughout the country that is specifically intending to prevent teachers from teaching the very thing from which the context of Juneteenth emerges. And so you have those same state legislatures who are attempting to prevent Black people from having the same access to the franchise as their counterparts. And so there is a sort of tension that exists there. But Juneteenth matters as a holiday, but in and of itself is not enough, most certainly as a holiday. And so I think we have to hold both of those realities at once.
I have one last question for you. It comes from YouTube. How can the USA prove that it has dealt with its slave-owning past? Wow. The final minute of our show. What would you say, Clint?
Say, how long do we have? Oh, man.
No pressure.
Yeah. We have to account for what has been done. One thing that we've invoked Germany a couple times in this show, and I'll say Germany has something called the stumbling stones. And there are tens of thousands of these in Germany, where if you go up to a Nike store or a McDonald's or a KFC or a yoga store, in front of some of these places will be a brick that is slightly elevated off the ground, a brass brick that has the names inscribed in them and the dates who were taken from these homes. And so I think that if we did something similar to that, like they do during the Holocaust in the context of slavery, it might go a long way in helping us.
He's the author of How the World is Past, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America. Clint Smith, thank you for being on the stream today. Take care, everybody. See you next time.